This podcast is brought to you by the American Enterprise Institute.
If you like what you hear, please subscribe, rate, review, and share.
Thanks for listening. Here's our show.
What the hell is going on?
What's really going on?
We said, what the hell happened?
You don't have to know what the hell is on it.
They see what's going on. I don't know what's going on. What is going on?
We must find out what is going on.
Hi, I'm Danielle Pletka.
I'm Mark Thiessen.
Welcome to our podcast. What the hell is going on in New York?
What the hell is going on is the Democrats have nominated a communist to run for mayor.
A communist anti-Semite.
A communist anti-Semite. And I swear, usually in American politics, when you say somebody's a communist, that's usually hyperbole. No, this is not hyperbole. He is actually a communist. This is a man who has literally tweeted that we need to seize the means of production for the workers. We need a policy from each according to his ability to each according to his needs, which is straight out of Karl Marx's description of communism, the end state of communism. So he is a communist. He is a Jew-hating anti-Semite.
What's not to like, New York?
Democratic primary in the most Jewish city in America. It's like you can't make this up. I'll tell you, Danny, it reminds me of my favorite story in politics, which is when I was growing up. I'm a New Yorker, an expat New Yorker. I grew up in New York. My mayor was His Honor Ed Koch, who was my favorite mayor growing up. And when Ed Koch lost the Democratic primary to David Dinkins, they asked him, Mr. Mayor, will you ever run again? And he said, no, the people have spoken and they must be punished. And that is exactly how I feel about New York if they put this pro-terrorist, anti-Semite commie in Gracie Mansion.
So I wanted to mention something in our conversation. In addition to being an unbelievable poser, a fabulist, pretend black person, a pretend Asian person, but not, to paraphrase one of my favorite lines, not a pretend idiot, he used to be a rapper, which is a whole new world of weird appropriation. Anyway, in 2017, he, as part of his unbelievably great rap career under two different monikers, one, Young Cardamom, it just, flows off the tongue, or later, Mr. Cardamom, he released a song called Salam. And the song was dedicated in part to praising the Holy Land Five. Now, I want to remind people who these guys are. The Holy Land Five were 5 indicted conspirators of a nonprofit based out of Texas that was called the Holy Land Foundation that was in fact funneling money to Hamas, a terrorist organization. And not, by the way, a terrorist organization like some, which also engages in some good guy activities, but also likes to kill people. Hamas is just a terrorist organization. That's all they do. They steal money, they steal stuff, they kill people, they terrorize people. That was who Hamas was. That is who Hamas is. And one of the lines in this outstanding rap was, "My love to the Holy Land Five. You better look them up." That's who New York thinks they should elect as their mayor. What has happened to this city?
Well, so here's the thing. So there's a lot of people after Mamdani was winning saying, particularly on the left of the Democratic Party, who were super energized by this and said, this is the way, this is the path out of the wilderness for us, is going back and energizing our base and all the rest of it. And, here's why that's not the case. So Mamdani is a socialist running in the bluest of blue cities in America in a Democratic primary in an off year, running against a disgraced former governor who had to resign over a sex scandal and who many New Yorkers blame for killing their grandparents.
But other than that, Mrs. Lincoln,
you can't recreate those conditions in Pennsylvania or Michigan or Wisconsin or Arizona or Georgia or North Carolina or Nevada. This is not your path out of the wilderness, people. But Democrats, if you think it is, more power to you. I ask you to absorb that lesson and say, this is our future. This is the path. This is the way, to quote the Mandalorian. Because if you do, I am down for the next generation of series of Republican victories at the national level, because that's what's going to happen if you follow the Mamdani path out of the wilderness.
Yeah, it's crazy. But when I was talking just earlier to Stephen and Olivia about this, it's not just that this guy is an anti-Semite and a leftist that makes Elizabeth Warren look moderately normal. It is that he has been endorsed by Chuck Schumer, the former majority leader leader of the Senate, Chuck Schumer, the senator from New York, who calls
Who's terribly
himself
afraid of Ocasio-Cortez challenging him, who is Mondami's biggest
Great mate,
supporter.
yes.
So that's what that's all about.
Right, but it doesn't matter that that's it's all about. Chuck Schumer likes to call himself the shomer. A shomer is a guardian in Hebrew and in the Bible, and he likes to call himself as the senior most Jewish official in American politics, as the shomer of the interests of the Jewish people. You know, that's a lovely sentiment. I don't think that when you elect somebody who rapped about how great Hamas was and its supporters in America, you're actually doing a really good job with your whole shomer thing. But it's not just Chuck Schumer. Chuck Schumer endorsed him. Governor Kathy Hochul endorsed him. And Bill Clinton came out of his irrelevant vegan retirement in order to say how great it was. What is wrong with these people that they think this is the future of the Democratic Party? This is like the eternal MAGA, diet.
What was the term you used for Schumer, that he thinks he's the guardian of the Jewish people? What's the term?
Shomer.
Shomer. Chuck Schumer is the shomer of his political future, is what he
Exactly.
is. He is cowering in fear of the Democratic Socialist Movement, whose epicenter has moved to Queens, which and AOC. The transition has happened where it started in Vermont and it is now the epicenter is in AOC's district, and she wants to challenge him one day for the Senate. And so he has endorsed a guy who not only praised the, what were they called, the Hamas Five, but he
The Holy
actually
Land
praised
Five, yeah.
Anwar al-Awlaki, the al-Qaeda leader that Obama killed in a drone strike. This is a guy who tweeted out, if we want to be full participants in the economy, we need worker ownership of the means of production. This is a guy who tweeted out when Cuomo said in 2020 that when people are saying defund the police, they are saying we want to see real fundamental change. He tweeted out, no, we want to defund the police. There's no question about who this guy is and what he represents. He represents everything that has cost the Democratic Party, the last presidential election that led to the rise of Donald Trump and the banishment of the Democrats into the wilderness. And so, go for it, guys. I think this guy's got a bright future. I think that Mayor of New York is only the first stepping stone to this man's future of possibilities. I think the Democrats should embrace him and everything he stands for. I think this will be very, very good for the Democratic Party.
Yes,
Take my
I know.
advice. Because I care deeply about the future of the Democratic Party. And so, I'm obviously being facetious, but you know what? I'm torn between two sentiments, which is one, we really do need a normal Democratic Party because we need in a two-party system where there are no third parties. Sorry, Elon Musk. There's really a two-party system. We need both our parties to be normal, or at least a broad definition of normal, right?
Very broad.
So it is very bad for the country that the Democratic Party is excited about this, but you know what? Really good for the Republican Party. So,
good luck to
I'm
them.
going to wear my partisan hat today, not my American hat. I know it's just the 4th of July, only recently behind us, and I should be more patriotic, but I'm putting on my partisan hat. I think this is great. Go for it, guys.
Mark Thiessen, you heard it here first, people. He is voting absentee in New York for Zohran Mamdani. Hey, everybody, we have a new guest, somebody you haven't met before, but I'm sure a very familiar voice from his own appearances on the Commentary podcast, which usually features not only their editor, John Podhoretz, but also our colleague, Matt Continetti, and others. It's a fantastic one if you haven't listened to it. He is Seth Mandel, the senior editor of Commentary magazine. He writes on Israel, anti-Semitism, national politics. He was the executive editor of the Washington Examiner before that, and an op-ed editor at the New York Post.
Here's our interview. So, Seth, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Mark. Danielle, good to see you guys.
Okay, so what the hell is going on in New York?
What a good question.
I think a lot of people would say hell is going on in New York.
Yeah.
But the answer is contained in your question. Hell is going on in New York. I think that what you're seeing is people who were sick of Andrew Cuomo and they voted for Zohran Mamdani and are now learning about him. But the question is whether it's too late to stop the momentum from him winning the Democratic primary, and, whether there's a way for people who might have a bit of regret about their votes to do anything about it. But that, I think, is what's happening, is that this guy came along and he seemed energetic and funny and nobody really paid that close attention. But it's a blue city in a blue state, and a blue primary electorate in a blue city in a blue state is usually very blue and very small. And so it's made up of activists and people, the door knockers, convinced to get out there and vote for whatever reason they told them. So I think that is what happen. What is happening is that the train is rolling and nobody has proposed a serious way to stop the train before it rolls off the cliff.
Yes. So I want to talk about the politics, but I want to talk about the politics at the end because I want to talk about Zohran Mamdani himself. I was just sitting at dinner with my husband and my oldest daughter and pointed out that Mamdani's father, who Mamdani has said that he agrees with all the time, created an embassy, a quasi-embassy to have relations with North Korea in Uganda.
North Korean Friendship Society.
Yes, and distributed Juche, which is Kim Il-sungism, which is the false religion of North Korea literature. I feel like it all starts there. And, in America, we don't believe in corruption of the blood, but damn, those are some parents to have. So tell us a little bit about Zohran Mamdani and his fam.
Sure. So Zohran's parents are Mahmoud Mamdani, who is a Columbia professor and head of department there for a while.
I have to interject. Of course he's a Columbia professor.
That's right. Goes without saying that there's somebody in Columbia in this family. And I believe he came aboard in the late 90s as their African studies director. This is Mahmoud. He was born in Bombay, but he grew up in Uganda, and that is where Zohran was born. Zohran's mother is Mira Nair, who is an Academy Award nominated filmmaker. So it's an Indian family, but Zohran was born in Uganda, and then when he was about 5, they moved to South Africa, which is actually an interesting part of the story to come back to, but he's about 5. When he was, I think, 7, they moved to New York City. And so his life has been Uganda, South Africa, but mostly America. And so when he talks about the kind of things he talks about, the third worldism that he talks openly about, or the global South, all these buzzwords, these progressive buzzwords, the truth is that the memories he has before America are probably not so strong. And the reason I brought up the South Africa is there was an interesting thing that he said the other day. Somebody posted a video of him eating rice. This went around a lot because people were criticizing him for eating rice with his hands. But the more interesting part of the video to me was where he was saying, growing up in South Africa, it was normal to wear the keffiyeh on behalf of the Palestinian struggle and to sort of internalize that struggle and all that. And again, he was there from ages 5 to 7. There's no way that he walked around with any sort of socio-political consciousness of any kind. And there's certainly, I would be willing to bet anyway, that there's no pictures of him in a keffiyeh at 5 years old. It wouldn't really make sense. But that tells you a lot about him because Zohran Mamdani is one of those people who thinks that anti-Zionism is a personality. We all know these people, that they think anti-Zionism is a full personality and they adopt it, and that's just who they are. And so it has colored everything he's spoken about America also, from the beginning, where he talks about America's complicity, etc., America's defense of Israel. He sees it as a sort of neo-colonialism, and that he speaks the same as the progressives on campus do, because again, he was raised in American academia. He was formed, I should say, in the world, in the atmosphere of American academia. He was not fully formed in Uganda, which he left by the time he was 5. He was not fully formed, spending 2 years as a young child in South Africa. He came to America and he lived in this intellectual milieu with his mother, the filmmaker, and his father, the radical professor. And that is really where he got all this stuff from. So he tries to present it as, well, so worldly, I was in South Africa and, as toddlers, we walked around with the keffiyeh, of course, and in Uganda, this and that. But the truth is that his influence is the same as you see on campus everywhere else, and his father is a really big part of that. So a lot of this is constructed. The idea that he would look into a camera and say, when I was growing up in South Africa, it was totally normal to walk around in the keffiyeh and internalize the Palestinian struggle, etc., etc. Although he has this radical world around him, really a radical bubble, I would say, he still kind of makes stuff up, right? He's still constructing this persona very carefully in ways that are unnecessary if you're in this world of the Columbia type political radicalism. But he seems to think that he has a problem with authenticity. that he has to prove his authenticity. And he also seems to recognize that people, especially on the left, who are already open to his ideas, take them more seriously when you say words like Uganda and Cape Town and things like that, especially South Africa, given its history with apartheid and all that. So I think that he is presenting himself as a much more foreign-formed person than he really is. He strikes me as sort of privileged American kid who is just
fake.
sort of swimming in academia and the academic world and that brand of progressive intellectualism.
So he's proving his authenticity through cultural appropriation.
Yes.
Exactly. So walk us through just Mamdani for idiots. There's all this stuff flying around about some of the stuff he said, not just about, I mean, there's a lot of anti-Semitism and a lot of anti-Zionism, which are the same thing, but also, Marxism. And give us Mamdani for idiots. Give us the case against him.
Well, when he's talking to the DSA, the Democratic Socialists of America, which again, those are his people, his environment, he said that the goal is to seize the means of production. So one of his quotes is to seize the means of production, which is really, just not even euphemistically speaking. And I remember when Barack Obama was heavily criticized for saying, we got to spread the wealth around. And that was like taken as a sort of, as like a Marxist euphemism or something. But this is like Marx recreation. And so, seize the means of production is the kind of things that he says. He had a plan where he proposed raising taxes on neighborhoods that he said, and we're quote, richer and whiter. Those are his words, right? So he's comfortable playing these racial games despite his own, or maybe because of his own struggles with his own authenticity and all that. But he's fully comfortable saying things out loud, right? Specifically that you normally hear euphemistically, right? So you very rarely hear, we should tax white people more. Usually you hear there's certain privileged neighborhoods, certain zip codes, things shouldn't depend on your zip code, whether you have a supermarket or a dollar store shouldn't depend on your zip code, etc. Whether you go to a good school shouldn't depend on your zip code. People talk about the changing neighborhoods, right? And gentrification in cities in New York and elsewhere. They use these terms to say there's a lot of white people around and they're making everything more expensive or they're changing the character of the neighborhood and I don't like it. But he just says we should tax white people more, which is a preposterous thing to say, or white neighborhoods, I should say, because that is to be fully accurate. What that means, maybe, wherever the New York Times building is located on 8th Avenue or whatever, but, I don't know what white neighborhood really means, but it's a slippery phrase that is also oddly specific. There's a story recently that he checked Black or African American on his Columbia application. He did confirm that. The story is not that he did, but it recently came out. He did confirm that. And he said that, look, there's not a lot of nuance on these applications. It's not like I could check a box that says Ugandan, but also African American. It's not possible that Zoran Mamdani, son of longtime Columbia professor and son of famous movie-making mother, does not know the real implications of checking the box that says Black or African American. He didn't get into Columbia in the end, which is its own sort of interesting thing. It's not as though his scores were terrible or anything, but he just wasn't one of the lucky few. But you see him time and again, I think, checking that box. Yes, it's an old story. He's not 17 anymore. And of course, when kids are trying to get into college, maybe people do things that try to sweeten the pot a bit. But the reason it doesn't feel like an old story is because it sounds a lot like we should tax white neighborhoods more, right? It sounds a lot like the sort of things that he says now and doesn't really back away from. So I just think it's indication that he really has kind of had this propensity to play racial politics, at least through his entire adult life. And then there was another one. He wanted to get rid of the statue of Christopher Columbus, which is, again, that's a sort of stock progressive thing. And we went through this period of time where we started taking down statues of Confederate generals and ended up taking down statues of Thomas Jefferson and George Washington. And so in a way, that's sort of a moment in time story. But again, it also shows that he signs on to all of the fads, all of the progressive political fads he's there for. So whatever is in, he'll say things like queer justice, defunding the police is queer justice or whatever. He'll combine all these different buzzwords, right, to make a perfect intersectionality salad. He will, if people are saying words like queer justice at one point in time, he will just add those words to the end of every sentence. That's kind of what he does. And so he's a mush at this point. After all these years, I say, well, after all these years, he's like 34. But after all these years, he's a mush of concepts. And that is sort of where he comes from. Now, the big one that really caused a stir was when he was on a Bulwark podcast. He was asked point blank whether he can condemn the phrase globalize the Intifada. He not only refused to do it, but he spun himself in circles to talk about what people might mean when they say that, what disadvantaged groups might mean when they say that. He hears it as a cry for freedom and equality and a sort of striving for rights and all that stuff. But again, this is kind of like the checking that Black or African American box on the Columbia application, in that he knows what globalize the Intifada means. He's not confused. He knows the implications of globalize the Intifada as a phrase. He's young, but he is not young enough to not have been alive during the Intifada, at least the second Intifada, which is generally what people are referring to when they say Intifada. So, he's playing at ignorance. But what was really interesting about that is that in the past, he said things like, we should defund the police. And then during the primary campaign against Andrew Cuomo and others, he backtracked from that slightly. Nah, we're not going to defund the police. And I think Democrats nationally have tried to move away from that. We've all seen that. But he doesn't back away from globalize the Intifada. He'll toss defund the police under the bus, but he won't cross globalize the Intifada off the list. Something about this issue, the Palestinian issue, his anti-Zionism, is so crucial to how he sees himself and what he sees as his purpose in the political world, that he will white knuckle it and hold on for dear life. But that is the thing he won't let go of.
So we want to explore the anti-Semitism, but before we do that, I don't want to leave the Marxism yet. So Bernie Sanders calls himself a democratic socialist. AOC is a democratic socialist. It strikes me, if you look at what you said about seizing the means of production, the fact that he wants government grocery stores, which, is echoes of GUM and the Soviet Union. Now, I guess Tucker Carlson probably likes government grocery stores in Russia now, but he also tweeted...
And Bernie has shopped at them.
Exactly. And in Cuba, too, though. He goes to the diplomatic ones that take dollars. But he literally tweeted out, each according to their need, each according to their ability, which is verbatim quote from Karl Marx. Is it fair to say he's a communist?
I guess. I know that he considers himself a socialist. He calls himself a socialist. So I've thought that that's enough. But he certainly, any group that will use those phrases unironically, he's a part of. That's how I would put it. That he can't really distance himself from people who use the phrases that he uses as the bedrock of their worldview. And by the way, I also think that Eric Adams, who's now the mayor of New York City, and he'll be running for re-election, I think he's going to seize on the Marxism, socialism, communism stuff the most. I think that Eric Adams, he's been a very good friend to Jews and others who are concerned about anti-Semitism. So I don't think he's going to let the anti-Semitism go. But you've noticed, he was on a podcast at the Free Press, the website The Free Press, and he was on with Coleman Hughes, actually. And he said, I've been to Cuba, I've been to Venezuela, I've seen the empty shelves. That's what Eric Adams said. So I think that he's getting the prompts from his people that all of the anti-Semitism stuff brings a wild, defensive, overly defensive backlash against you from his fans and from the mainstream media and people like that. But the socialism and the Marxism stuff is really kind of, it's like hitting the broadside of a barn. He doesn't hit back and his people don't hit back because he doesn't walk away from that stuff. And nobody says, oh, you're red baiting, because he just says things like each according to his means, and he says things like seize the means of production. So his defenders in that sense are caught in the bind of, well, we can't really spin our way out of this one. We just have to defend the Marxist stuff as it is, and just go to the front of the line and defend it. And they found ways to cry Islamophobia if you bring up some of the Palestinian stuff and some of the other anti-Zionist stuff that he's brought about. And if you criticize the fact that he co-founded his Bowdoin College's chapter of Students for Justice in Palestine, which is now at this moment easily the most radical group on campus, part of the so-called Tentifada and all that. But if you bring up all these things, people will push back because anti-Zionism and this hatred of Israel has so much support, but nobody really pushes back on the Marxism stuff. And so I think that that is a really rich vein, and one that it's hard to get knocked off track on. It's harder for people to change the subject and say, oh, you're an Islamophobe, you're this or that or whatever. The Marxism stuff is he just recites it chapter and verse on the record with a smile on his face, and people are left with the choice to either defend it or not defend it, but there isn't really a way around it.
Yeah,
Just
no,
for the
it's-
record, so we
go
know,
ahead.
this is the quote from Marx, just so people know. In the higher phase of communist society, after the enslaving subordination of the individual to the division of labor, and therewith the antithesis between mental and physical labor has vanished, only then can the narrow horizon of bourgeois right be crossed in its entirety, and social society inscribe on its banners, from each according to his ability to each according to his needs. So Marx identifies this as the central tenet of communism. So no better authority than Karl Marx to prove to us that Zoran Mamdani is a communist.
And his father got into Marx through his activism in the civil rights movement and stuff like that. You know,
Yeah.
Mahmoud Mamdani was involved in several of the marches, and he had gotten himself in legal trouble and arrested, and he, through that, according to him, is where he discovered Marx, through the progressive political activism, even though it was a bit obviously more legitimate that he was beginning in. But the point is that he got pulled into the world of progressive activism, and this is where it seems to inevitably end up.
But I gotta say, and I want to talk about his anti-Semitism because I do think that's actually intrinsic to who he is. I've got to say, if I had to engage in some cheap pop psychology, I would say he's actually his mother's son. He's an actor. Mouthing Marxist tropes is just what he thinks the cool kids do. It's like the fake garbage about South Africa. It's like the fake garbage about being black. It's like the fake garbage about being Asian. He has no authenticity when it comes to this. He has grown up a child of privilege in the financial capital of the world, New York. This is just an outfit he wears and slogans he chants. I think he's an actor. It's not that I don't think that he believes these things. I think that he doesn't have any idea what they mean because he's a fucking moron. That's why I didn't get into Columbia, by the way. And this is what I was talking about with you guys before we got on. Where I feel he is genuinely authentic is in his hatred of Jews. I feel like that is like in his heart. Who founds Students for Justice in Palestine at Bowdoin? And who isn't getting high at Bowdoin? What is wrong with him? This is somebody who is truly motivated by his antipathy to the Jewish people. At least that's my feeling. And I mean, let's just dive quickly. And we've eaten up a ton of time, and I really want to talk about the politics of New York and a bunch of other stuff. But just talk about, it's not just globalize the Intifada. It's everything. It's about the right of Israel to exist. It's about Zionism. It's about the Jewish state. It's about appearing on Hassan Piker, for our listeners who don't know, this Twitch streamer, gaming streamer who calls Orthodox Jews inbred, compares Israelis to the Klan, defended Hamas's attack on the Nova Music Festival, and told off a listener who condemned the massacre by calling him a bloody, thirsty, violent pig dog. Suck my dick. Nice guy. Hassan Piker is a real quality
And
individual.
there goes our explicit rating through.
We do have an explicit rating.
Renewed for eternity. Thank you,
For a
Dave.
generation. So, I mean, this is something he's good with.
Yeah.
Tell us more about it.
Sure. So I think, you start with the Students for Justice in Palestine, the chapter, because people who were around at the time have explained that they were people at other groups. J Street on campus, by the way, was one of them. Have said that Mamdani, when he really took control of the group, at first he co-founded it, but then he really sort of, at least 51%, let's just say. It wasn't, he really was the guy in control. He instituted what they called a policy of non-normalization. So if you were at a liberal group like J Street, you weren't able to have events with Zoran Mamdani's SJP either, because essentially what he did was say, we won't work with anybody who thinks Israel has a right to exist. That's what non-normalization means. J Street is too extreme for them because J Street thinks that Israel has a right to exist. I mean, that's about the long and short of it. And so he started this way, and he's never really veered off of that particular one. He was asked during the campaign a couple times, once at a mayoral debate, at the primary debate, about whether he thinks that Israel has a right to exist as a Jewish state. So this was the question asked of the first crop of university presidents who walked into the wood chipper of Elise Stefanik and Virginia Fox and other Republican members of Congress, especially on the Education Committee, who were holding hearings on anti-Semitism after October 7th, 2023. And this was the question that tripped up the first group. Can Israel exist? Should Israel exist as a Jewish state? Does it have to exist as a Jewish state? I think that the way that Claudine Gay, she was president of Harvard at the time, she is not now, although she's still affiliated with Harvard. But Claudine Gay was the first to be asked that question. And she turned it around and she said, I believe that Israel has a right to exist, or whatever, something like that. And just repeated the whole phrase without the word Jewish state. And her fellows, her peers on the bench there, the other college presidents who were there at the time with Claudine Gay, just echoed that. Zoran Mamdani did pretty much exactly the same thing. He picked up on that, which is that you can take the Jewish state, the Jewish part out of it, and spit the answer back at the questioner and sound clever, I guess. But he basically repeated verbatim what Claudine Gay did at that hearing. And as we all know, nobody bought it when Claudine Gay did it, right? She's no longer the president of Harvard University. So, that was the beginning of the end for her and other presidents, of people who the public felt were tiptoeing around these things that were obviously wrong because they didn't want to condemn them. And so Zoran Mamdani, yes, he'll say that Israel has the right to exist. He doesn't say as a Jewish state. And that's another thing he won't really bend on. And more recently, though, so he's a state assemblyman. He's been in office for now close to 4 years, 3.5 years, suddenly decided at the last time that the resolution essentially condemning the Holocaust, it's really what it was, came around, he had already declared his candidacy for mayor of New York City. He declined to back it in the assembly. He also declined to back another one that was talking about Israel as a friend of the United States or whatever. So he's somebody who doesn't just express anti-Zionism and then say, you're linking Zionism and Judaism. You're the one who's combining the two. I didn't say anything about the state of Israel. You can see that he won't condemn an anti-Semitism resolution. By the way, the easiest one in the world to condemn. I don't know how anyone would struggle with that. And I also don't know why he thinks he would get in trouble for that. Even in the Democratic primary, you can condemn the Holocaust and get away with it. But he's so careful about these tripwires on the left. So, he's the guy who he won't condemn anti-Semitism and he won't talk about Israel as a friend of America and whatever. He's the one that combines these. He combines it all together. That's where you get the anti-Semitism. He doesn't see a difference. He sees his anti-Zionism as requiring him to keep his distance from condemning the Holocaust. That's kind of a major theme of his work and public policy, and especially the campaign, which, this happened during.
One of the things that he has said is that as mayor of New York would arrest Benjamin Netanyahu if he came to speak at the United Nations. I mean, putting aside the fact that New York police can't arrest world leaders who are coming on diplomatic passports to, engage in diplomacy at the UN, I assume, speaking at the General Assembly or something like that. What does that say about him?
I think that is part of what Danielle was referring to before about the performative aspect of this. He must know he can't make some kind of citizen's arrest of Benjamin Netanyahu. This reminds me during the Iraq War how, judges in Spain were filing arrest warrants for Dick Cheney. Dick Cheney ever went to Spain, you were supposed to find him and arrest him on the street. These are patently ridiculous ideas, but they get you noticed and they get you headlines, and that's what he wants. So I think that's part of the performative thing is, what's he going to do? Make a citizen's arrest of Benjamin Netanyahu? But the larger part of that is that he really hasn't thought, he can't think past the anti-Zionism, right? In other words, let's play this out. What happens if a guy who says, I'm going to arrest the prime minister of the state of Israel, becomes the mayor of New York City, the largest Jewish community in any American city and the largest outside of Israel, in any city outside of Israel? I mean, New York is as Jewish a city as they come, so to speak. And with that, by the way, means, plenty of Holocaust survivors and all the rest. What what happens when that guy becomes mayor of New York City, right? How could he possibly work? Now, people say mayors don't have foreign policies, but it's not entirely true. New York is such a global city that the mayors of New York do have foreign policies to some extent, and they work with all the communities in New York. I mean, that is the sort of melting pot or whatever people like to use, but that is what you will hear from people on the left who will say, this is America. America is this place where people are from all over the place. And so in New York, that really is true. And you really do have to be able to work with the communities in New York. And imagine trying to work with the Jewish communities. After saying that, imagine trying to work with the Israeli expat community. But also, New York has all sorts of relationships with Israel, just as states do. States have trade agreements or whatever, sister state projects and things like sister city projects and things like that. They get involved in economic policies, economic trades to firmly establish the relationship between America and Israel. A lot of that does happen at the states. And at the states is where you see, for example, state legislatures passing anti-BDS legislation, right? So a lot of this really does happen at the state and local level. And New York City is as much a state in that regard in this way as any. So I don't know what he's looking at. He can't see 10 feet in front of him. He's just, today, I'm going to please the left by saying I'm going to arrest Bibi Netanyahu. And in his mind, a person who says that isn't even thinking about realistically becoming mayor, right? It's like the dog that caught the car. What if he becomes mayor? He probably started this out thinking he's a long shot and he's going to say all these crazy things and not have to deal with the consequences.
So let's talk the politics. Nate Silva had a really interesting article analyzing the numbers. About 1 million people voted in these primaries. If you just looked at it straight on, you saw that Mamdani beat Cuomo, disgusting retread murderer of elderly COVID victims, by 7%. If you look at it in the ranked choice system, he beat him by 12%. 1 million people didn't vote in New York in 2024 or in 2020. 1.8 million people voted in 2024. 2 million people voted in 2020. Now, this is an off-year election. Nate says, if 1 million people show up, Mamdani wins. If the same number of people who voted in a presidential year show up, Mamdani's not sure of winning. What are the politics here? And by the way, as a New Yorker, please help us also understand how the hell 1/3 of New York's highest earners voted for him. Another insane piece that I read. So
well,
help
that's
us
the
understand.
simple part, right? Zoran Mamdani has a politics that comes from being raised around privilege, where you don't necessarily understand the value of a dollar, right? I think that's part of it, which is like Rob Henderson coined the term luxury beliefs. A lot of this progressive stuff, they are luxury beliefs. It's a luxury to be able to say, I'm going to vote for the guy who wants to, nationalize grocery stores and stuff like that and seize the means of production, right? You have to be somewhat insulated from the consequences of him even trying to turn those policies into reality in order to sign on to them. And then, of course, if that ever happens, they're the most mobile, they'll move somewhere else. But, flee New York, which happened during COVID, happened elsewhere. So that's, I think, what's going on with that. The truth be told, New York politics has not usually been as leftist as it feels right now. I like to tell the story of, it's probably 15 years ago or not even. My wife and I, we went to a concert in New York City. It was Our Lady Peace. It was a Canadian rock band. And they, being from Canada, they just assumed that everybody in downtown New York hates cops as much as they hate everything else that is sort of coded right, as we say in politics. They had as their opening act a sort of beat poet. The beat poet came out there and he slammed the NYPD pretty harshly. He was literally booed off the stage in downtown Manhattan at a rock club. Later on in the show, the singer from Our Lady Peace, which again, this is a famous rock band. This is the poet was not famous, but Our Lady Peace is very famous. So why they would go out on a limb for this guy, I'm not really sure. But they later said, by the way, it was kind of rude how you guys welcomed our opening act. We think he's a cool kid and we want him to be able to finish it. So they brought him back out in the middle of Our Lady Peace's headlining set, right? They brought him back out and they said, finish what you're doing. And again, not only was he booed off the stage, but bottles were thrown at, I saw like a beer bottle at one point go up onto the stage. It was wild. This is not a particularly rowdy crowd, but this is how much politics feels like it has changed in just that decade or decade and a half, which is not that long ago. If you were a beat poet opening act at a downtown rock club, you could be booed off the stage for going too hard on the NYPD. And why? Because liberals also like to be safe, right? This was the thing that a lot of people outside of New York didn't understand about New York, is that you can't have your 3 avenue wide farmers markets on Sunday in the city if you don't have a safe city, right? You can't have the things that this culture, this sort of liberal culture, requires: safety and security. And so for a long time, it was, except for the NYPD, essentially, is the way to understand it, right? Everybody wants to be safe, and you can't drive out of the city the people who will spend money on the types of businesses and shops that you like and things like that. You know, again, it's a sort of luxury beliefs situation. But now you sort of get the feeling like New York has forgotten. It's been long enough since New York was a genuinely unsafe city. It has been now, 30 years, right? Since New York has been an unsafe city. And I think that you're having a sort of generational turnover in which people seem to be more willing to experiment with New York City politics because they just don't remember. I lived in Washington Heights briefly during the Giuliani years. I lived in Washington Heights again during the Bloomberg years. If you were there, you know, even if you didn't spend a ton of time there, but if you lived in certain neighborhoods, and Washington Heights was one of them, right? That went from one of the least safe to like one of the top 5 neighborhoods for safety in New York City at one point, and you saw the difference right in front of your eyes, you remember that. But we're talking about people who don't even have memory of a Giuliani administration. And so I think that that's a real problem. That's a real kind of, well, what's the worst that can happen attitude sprouting among enough New Yorkers these days to make something like Zoran Mamdani a reality.
Yeah, but you've got, the subways are completely unsafe. I had a college classmate who was walking across the Manhattan Bridge and just was attacked by a homeless man and pummeled in the head and died. It's a pretty dangerous city. And you look at someplace like Chicago, which is probably the most dangerous city in America, and they had, Lori Lightfoot, and they had a choice between a normal guy and somebody worse, and they chose the worst guy. I think part of it is that the people who remember how bad it was back then have all moved to Florida and Texas. Am I wrong?
Or they're planning on it, so.
Yeah. So talk to us how this plays out. So, Eric Adams is now running as an independent. Cuomo dropped out, but he's sort of trying to get Adams to drop out so he can run as the independent. What's the final ballot going to look like? And does Mamdani have a chance of winning?
So the final ballot is going to be Zoran Mamdani and Curtis Sliwa on the Republican side, and Eric Adams on the here I am stuck in the middle with you side. And, Eric Adams is not exactly popular, right, at the moment. There's a reason, I was going to say there's a reason you change parties to run again, but the truth is that Michael Bloomberg also did that, and he did just fine. So that's not necessarily evidence, but he's not very popular, and he's obviously in legal hot water. Yes, Trump helped him out of that particular legal hot water, but he represents a politics that people think is kind of slimy a bit, right? They hear this stuff, they think he's taking money from, I don't know, he's getting first class tickets to Turkey on Turkish Airlines or whatever. Like, they hear things that, even if he's not necessarily illegal or they're not taking his career down and sending him to prison over, they don't like. It doesn't sound right. It sounds like the politics of establishment entitlement. That's what a lot of people see when they look at everybody running against Zoran Mamdani. A feeling of establishment entitlement. Eric Adams thinks that he can do whatever he wants, and then he'll just get Trump to bail him out. Andrew Cuomo thinks he can do whatever he wants, and then come back and will roll out the red carpet for him to be mayor of New York City after everything he did during COVID and beyond, right? They see these guys as entitlement figures. And Curtis Sliwa is different, obviously, but he is coming from the Republican side, and there's simply not the votes for that lane, right? And certainly not for Sliwa himself, who, I don't mean that as anything against Curtis Sliwa, who I know personally, but just that the lane that Sliwa is trying to run is just not a viable lane in this time in New York right now. I think you'd have to have somebody run as an independent who can win as an independent. That's really the only lane that seems to be left over, because I think Sliwa is the type of guy who maybe you run after Mamdani gets elected and has a term or so in office. And if you see things take a certain turn, you say, I want the guy who used to stalk the streets to protect people like Batman or whatever in the Guardian Angels type thing in there instead. I don't think that the votes are there for somebody who's predicting disaster. I think that what people need is a sense that there will be the stability with whoever they go with instead of Mamdani if they're looking for an alternative. You're telling me Mamdani means all this chaos in the city, and you're telling me that Mamdani means, public security is thrown into question. There's all these things we don't know. But if you're right about Mamdani, if you're halfway right about Mamdani, boy, that's going to be really bad. So who do you have instead? It's been a difficult conversation with people because they know Eric Adams and they don't necessarily love him. He's delightfully weird as you have to be a New York City mayor. He has the resume of, that type of New Yorker, but he won the first time around on, I think, really security and public safety concerns, because as a guy who was closely tied throughout his career to the NYPD, he was somebody who was seen as, left as politics go, I'm not gonna toss all the cops under the bus. No matter what, even if you think I'm gonna be a Bill de Blasio type progressive ideologically, I'm not gonna be the guy that, as happened with Bill de Blasio when he was mayor, police stand up and walk out of the hall on or turn their back on when he speaks at a funeral or something like that. That was the safety net for Eric Adams. I don't know what the safety net is now. Zoran Mamdani says, what do we need, these cops always showing up for? Let's just send social workers and all these other bizarre sort of trendy ideas on the left. I don't think that I think Eric Adams has used up probably that one safety and stability argument the first time, and voters are less likely to do it again if they don't really like where it took them, even if the stability was there, right? Even New York has not become a dangerous city under Eric Adams. In fact, I think this year might be headed for its lowest murder rate in a very long time. It's got a low homicide rate, it's got a low, certain types of violent crime are up, but the most violent among them, as they say, are not. And so it's not as though people think Eric Adams was lying when he says he'd have the city be secure. But I just think, can you play that card a second time as an incumbent? It seems like a real uphill battle, right? It seems like if you're going to win re-election after a scandal-plagued term, you have to be able to offer a new argument for this exact moment going forward. And I think he did that when he won his first term, and I don't think he's done that yet, but we'll see. We'll see. As I said before, he's making the Marxism argument and all that, and he's going to rely on the idea that people didn't know all this stuff about Zoran Mamdani, which was true. The question is it enough? In a three-way race with an unpopular incumbent at the center of it, doesn't feel like it would be enough, right? If we're talking about the normal fundamentals of political campaigns, if you took everybody's names off these and you said unpopular mayor at the center of a three-way race, you would pencil in whoever is in Mamdani's spot right on that. And so they have to find a way to change the fundamentals of this race.
Yeah. Good luck, people who live in New York. Thank you. This was just a great conversation, and I'm really, really happy for once that I live in Northern Virginia and not in New York City. And yeah, my mom and my daughter who live in New York. Hey, sorry. Time to think about Florida. But yeah, thank you very much. Good luck.
Thank you, guys. No, that was great. Yes. Good luck to everybody.
Seth. Thank you. So Danny, what do you think?
Let's keep that in there. That's hilarious. So, look, I'll be honest with you. I agree with what you said in all seriousness, which is that we need a Democratic Party that is healthy and whole, because our country benefits from having a genuine debate about important matters of state. There are a lot of things to talk about, not just in the world, but also in the country. And the fact that the Democratic Party appears to be flushing itself down the toilet is not a good thing. And And, we have Democratic colleagues, Democratic friends in Washington, D.C., pollsters who are smart and good and look at this and just think to themselves, oh my God, this is the political equivalent of a self-immolation on the part of the Democratic Party. And yeah, as a
This
partisan
is the Democrats
matter,
literally and figuratively putting on a suicide vest.
Jesus, that's cold. But, look, that's what's going on. And so much of this is because they're lying to themselves about what happened in the 2024 election. What happened is not that they didn't go far left enough, not that they didn't go enough for identity politics, but that Americans don't want that crap. They don't like that extremism. They like borders. They don't like crime. They like a strong country. They don't like leaders who talk as if they'd worked for Stalin in 1922. Hey, that's just not how it works. But they haven't taken that message, and I don't know how many times they're going to need to get slapped before they get it.
Well, I don't know that New York is going to do the slapping is the problem. And here's why. Continuing in my theory of what's bad for the country but good for the Republican Party, the reality is that the reason why Mamdani could win in New York is because all the people who voted for Rudy Giuliani have moved to Florida and they've moved to Texas. And they're moving to West Virginia, believe it or not. It is one of the most inflow states in the country. They're moving to red states. And what that means is that in the next census, we are going to have a shift of electoral votes to the South and away from the blue wall states, which means that the blue wall that cracked in 2024 will disappear. And that means that the Republicans will have a huge advantage in the Electoral College. So the more we have people like Mamdani in New York, the more people leave New York and go to red states, which means that we will have an easier chance of keeping and holding on to the presidency because they are taking electoral votes with them. So Democrats, this is not the path out of the wilderness. This is the path into the wilderness at the national level, because even if you don't replicate him, he's going to drive so many people out of New York that New York's going to lose electoral votes and give them to the Republican states. And so literally electing this guy will seal your fate at the national level, whether or not you replicate him in other states or not. So go for it.
So go for it. Let us know
Yeah.
what you think, folks. Let us know whether you disagree. Now, you can't disagree. You wouldn't be listening to us. But
At this point,
at this point,
they
yeah,
might be
don't-
listening to us in the first 5 minutes and then leave. But if you've stayed this long, you probably don't disagree.
Exactly. And thanks for being with us.
See you next week. If you'd like us to cover, you can get in touch with the show by emailing us at whatthehell@aei.org.
Or you can reach us on Twitter. I'm at dpletka.
And I'm at Mark Thiessen. That's Mark with a C.
Please rate and review the podcast. If you like the show, please subscribe, share it, comment on Apple Podcasts, or wherever you're listening to this.
Thanks for listening.